Thanks for tuning in to Lightbox Live. We will begin our live stream panel discussion in just a moment.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Lightbox Live. Lightbox Live is our programming series at Lightbox dedicated to creating space for both emerging and established new media artists and technologists. So we'll be doing a Q&A at the end, so feel free to stick around, and if you have any questions, you can submit them on the chat or also DM us on Instagram if you don't want to create an account on Twitch. Our topic today is about standing out and establishing aesthetic. And we're going to be speaking with three panelists who have each developed a signature style in their work, from standing out on saturated online platforms to developing brand identity. So I'm going to present you to Blake Catherine. Blake is a visual artist based in LA whose work is recognized for its vibrant palettes, ethereal undertones with surreal futurist aesthetic. Next, we have Rory Scott. She's a multidisciplinary artist based in Chicago, and Rory's work is recognized for its use of patterns, glitters, and for its likeness to the universe. And finally, we have Orsolia Sabo. She's a Hungarian-born British stylist, creative director, tech co-founder, and writer based between LA and London. Last year, she co-founded and launched the camera app tech company Virtual Superland along with her partner, Natasha Smith. Welcome, everyone. So our first question is going to be for Blake. Blake, your digital images are as vibrant as they are intricate. Can you tell us what inspires your color palette, which seems to be so consistent and cohesive throughout the course of your work?
Thank you. Yeah, totally. So definitely growing up, I feel like whenever it comes to where something starts, especially subconsciously, it's always the cliche, go back to the childhood. And as a kid of the 90s, I definitely had like the Nickelodeon slime era and Lisa Frank and gel pens, and everything was very colorful and bold and vibrant. And while I wasn't practicing creative at the time, I definitely realized that that kind of seeped into my bones as when I started studying graphic design, as I started as a kind of traditional, more brand skewing commercial designer. I was really into kind of using those early roots. And upon graduating and moving to New York and learning 3D and all of that, I started realizing that I had a lot of geographic inspiration more than anything. That, you know, in Florida, I had the childhood, but I also had that kitschy tourism kind of pop art growing up. And then in New York, I saw myself, which I didn't even realize till probably a couple years later, really tone down that color palette use and kind of get more buttons up and polished and a little more minimal, like almost to an extreme degree more minimal. And when I started learning 3D, I kind of wanted to rebel and go back to my roots where I was a lot more bold with color and find a way to kind of tastefully apply what I had learned with less is more in my years working in New York with kind of what felt more authentic to me, which was kind of this over the top color vibe. And so right around learning 3D, I moved to LA, and it was kind of like the perfect pairing, especially being so easily influenced by my surroundings, where, you know, you have historic Art Deco buildings, which is where my love for kind of gold like became born. Before that, I was a silver girl. And just the cliche SoCal sunsets and all of that, and pastel buildings, etc. So it's really just been a direct product off of things that I've been surrounded by, whether it's a physical object, a building, or an environment. And then figuring out how to infuse that in a somewhat surreal yet believable enough manner into my own workflow. That's kind of where it's been for the past couple of years now.
That's really cool. Do you have a favorite color?
Yeah, mint. It's been like decades that mint is just my favorite color. But it's funny because I like never use it. I'm really bad at using mint, I think. So I like pretty much like lean into like oranges and like more pastel-y pinks and blues and purples, but mint ice cream and mint as a color is superior.
Cool. Thanks for sharing that. Our next question is for Rory. So you have a project called Impermanence. Can you share a little bit more about what that project is, and how did the project's theme play into developing your aesthetic? Because you've been building this over the last 6 or 7 years, I think.
Longer actually. Like, this project is kind of a beast, so it's kind of hard to sum it up in a nutshell. But I started working on Impermanence like 10 years ago, and it was born out of me like kind of realizing that I had like this obsession with time and kind of wanting to confront it. I was thinking a lot about my own impermanence and the permanence of people, places, and things that, you know, I've loved, and, you know, the inevitability of having to let go and say goodbye. And then like also thinking about like the impermanence of humanity as and how it relates to our ever evolving relationship with technology. So I kind of like wanted to address those things and also think about time in the sense of like using time as a tool for change rather than just thinking of time as like this agent of change. So I started with those ideas, and I was going through kind of like an awakening at the time, and I was journaling a lot. So I took my journal entries, and I thought like I would want to like share this somehow visually. And I kind of like had like I don't know, a roadblock when I got to that point. And, you know, I went back, you know, just like that, like to my childhood and thinking about like nostalgia and all the things I first found beauty in, like light, anything reflective, glitter. Lisa Frank was one, you know, like anything that like had like this sort of like otherworldly quality. And like, you know, my grandmother's home, like this is her home right there actually. It's like, you know, very ornate, tons of light and glitter. And this room or this tent I made is like inspired by one of the rooms in her house. But pulling all that together, and also like my love of patterns, which relate to like what I think or how I think about life philosophically. And also like I really love patterns visually. So I pulled that all in, and I started like creating these kind of like cosmic worlds. And as a project, initially I thought it was going to be a book, but after I started working on it, I realized I had to have motion and light. And so I started animating, and I'm in the process of like animating like these dioramas I made like 7 years ago, and turning it into like these like 360 like dreamscapes, so people can actually insert themselves within my thoughts and in my world in the near future, hopefully.
Mhm. I'll definitely be there if
Yeah,
I can join.
everyone's welcome. So
Orsolia, so from, you know, working as a stylist to launching virtual Superland, what do you think has caused this growing trend of combining, you know, fashion with high tech?
I think it's a couple of things. Like, and I also think the combining of fashion and tech has kind of been inevitable, because obviously we're more and more connected with our phones than we've ever been, and technology is more advanced than it's ever been. So, and also fashion is kind of like an expression of who we are. So naturally those two things are always going to collide, and there's going to be an intersection where that's just going to carry on exponentially growing. So I think it's those two things, but also sustainability. Like I think, especially like, for example, with Virtual Superland, our initial idea was, okay, if we make one green t-shirt like this, how could that become 6 different t-shirts? So instead of like, you know, people spending more money and buying more things, we kind of just streamline that whole process and make that more accessible digitally and more fun. So I think it's kind of, yeah, a combination of those 3 things.
Really cool. I want one of those shirts. So the next question is for Blake and Rory. Because it's so easy to share your work on digital platforms, you know, like Instagram, which I think is how we got in touch with you, you both, it can be like super difficult to also stand out or establish a trademark look. What advice would you give to emerging artists who are trying to hone in on their aesthetic? And we can start with Blake.
Yeah, no, I totally get it. And it's super difficult because not only are you feeling the pressure, you know, you see that dopamine hit, you get those likes, you can get competitive with yourself or with others, and there can be a lot of toxicity with developing that trademark look or trying to find your own like authentic journey. But at the same time, I think anytime I talk with colleagues or think about process myself and how I have gotten to where I am and how I hope to be in 5 to 10 years, et cetera, because it's an ongoing journey. I think the big thing is kind of almost going back to kind of the classic ways of creatively developing, which is much more analog, but also a big thing was you didn't have the oversaturation of so much visual inspiration constantly in front of you back then. So at the risk of sounding like I'm very angry, get off my porch person for a brief second. My first advice is whenever you are trying to go through these journeys and you feel really stuck, whether you're developing your style, whether you feel really comfortable in it, but you feel, stuck, etc. The worst thing you can do is to really allow yourself to be on those platforms and soak in tangible work. Because what I find often happens is not only is it regurgitation, but you're you're basically window shopping. Your eyeballs are like, I like that palette and I like the way that the lighting hits this person's model. And you can kind of start collaging together ideas that aren't authentic to you. And they kind of just feel more like a technical practice versus something that's really speaking your voice, your most authentic self. So for myself personally, like my favorite pieces and the pieces I'm most proud of, whether they're commercial or personal, have all been sketched on my couch, been developed while walking, listening to music. You see a cool flower, you're like, that's awesome. This inspires something from my sketchbook that I didn't know how to continue to work on. And just allowing yourself to kind of disconnect, but also marinate on your own ideas. The best ideas truly are thought over and revisited. They strengthen. You have time to kind of figure out the kinks, or maybe you realize something lacks a little bit of story or emotion you're trying to convey, and you can revisit it with a much more impactful angle because you're allowing yourself to stew on it. So to kind of summarize this thought, one of my least favorite phrases is everything's been done before and everything's been thought of and this and that, because, there's so many humans. But that's completely untrue. There's only one you. There's only one person who's been on your entire journey, which is yourself. And so figure out how to dig into that subconscious, your own background, listen to your internal voices, and let that flow into your work, because it's going to happen naturally if you actually take the time to practice that. And I think that's the most critical advice I can really give on the matter.
Awesome. Rory, what advice would you give to emerging artists who are trying to create their own aesthetic?
I think that you have to know what it is you hope to ultimately achieve with your work. What is it that you want your audience to feel? What are you trying to communicate? I think that once you know that, it's a lot easier to figure out where to look for your inspiration or source material to work from. And I think that when you're looking for source material, it has to be something that resonates with you. If it doesn't resonate with you, then it's not going to translate into your work, and it's not going to resonate there either. So it's really important, whoever you gravitate towards the most or keep coming up in your head or popping up on your radar, pull from there. And then beyond that, make as much work as often as possible. So I feel when you're in the process of constantly creating, you hit this stride and you're able to figure out what works, what doesn't work. And it just makes you a more efficient producer in general. And beyond that, I really think that this is something that I sometimes forget to do. I do it intuitively, but I don't do it to the point that I should do with intention. Back up away from your work and see how it looks from far away, because everything we look at is reduced down to this tiny little thumbnail. And I think that if it doesn't captivate people or make them want to engage, then it may be an amazing piece, but no one's gonna access it.
Cool. Orsolia, so your co-founder, Natasha, she has a background in film and is self-taught in motion graphics, and you have a background in fashion. So how did all these elements help to inform Virtual Superlens' identity?
I think the way that we started was kind of imperative in how we formed what it's about, in the fact that we really weren't perfect in it. When we first started, like you said, I was in fashion. I was a fashion editor for a number of years, and Tasha wasn't. We both love technology and apps and creating things, but we didn't know how to do anything really. So we started with both of us on Premiere Pro, and just clicking through and seeing what we can make, and just playing around with apps like Glitcher and things like that. And I was really interested in just altering images and how easily that could be done at home if you just have a little bit of patience and maybe just sit and figure it out. And I've always liked, and I think Tasha's been the same, always liked figuring things out. So from the beginning, also with my past industry, I think when I was in fashion, there's always this drive for perfection, especially for women. It's always don't leave the house unless you're perfect, whether that's subconscious, it's always kind of there. And I think Tasha and I both felt that we kind of liked that idea that we weren't creating something that was perfect from the off, you know, like it was always just starting, like just being brave enough to make something and then just using that as like a jumping off point for like creation of like further things. So if anyone ever goes really, really far back into what VSL is, we started as Whatever, which is this video series. And basically the things that we were creating, now we look back and we like cringe at what we were creating motion graphics wise. But I think what's happened is we've taken that whole idea of like, okay, you don't have to be brave. I mean, you've got to be brave. You don't have to be perfect. You just got to start. And then this whole process of just like carrying on working and figuring it out has kind of really has become the basis of what we do. Just is like, you know, just do it basically, which annoying that Nike has already got that. But it's funny because I started with this love of Premiere and like discovered the chroma key app, the chroma key tool, which is obviously the green screen tool, and then just kind of stayed in that and figuring that out of like, okay, how can we utilize this for like as a conduit for the whole experience? And Tasha really kind of dived into figuring out how to create better graphics and has really, you know, has spent the last 2 or 3 years just teaching herself, and it's kind of been amazing how she started with like After Effects and Illustrator and is now on like Blender and Cinema 4D. And I think that kind of transition of like, okay, we started with like, it's all a bit shaky, but you can see our progress and you could watch this kind of thing grow and evolve. Is kind of part of that whole identity, I guess. Yeah, and obviously we both are very aesthetically driven. Like, I use my hands so much. Sorry, I'm just I've got so many hats. Yeah, I think obviously being like, yeah, aesthetically driven, and both of us are really obsessed with just. I'm constantly inspired by random things like what Blake said before of like, you know, finding like a beautiful flower, or even just going outside and seeing like, I don't know, some random color combination with like things that have been discarded, and then that's inspiring you. And then the two of us just kind of always bring those two things together and we kind of build on that. So yeah, I hope that made sense.
I love that. Rory, so obviously you mentioned this work that you've been working on for the last 10 years. Is there a specific piece or project that you can point to that helped shape your signature aesthetic? And if you can think of that specific piece, can you tell us what that process was like?
Yeah, sure. So like, it's funny because I do actually have one piece where everything just came together, and I remember saying, that's it, you know, like it was one of those moments where I had been struggling for a long time and then it just like all made sense. Basically, like when I started, I was just using like real life source material. Like I took pictures of lights and smoke and of glitter, and I made like all these I don't know, designs like in Illustrator, and I combined like everything and collaged it into like a still piece. And like the day that like I actually got the direction that I was supposed to move in, I made this piece that looked like the universe, but it was like this design was laid over it, and it was like nothing I'd seen before, but incredibly familiar all at the same time. And that's kind of like what I went to go for with the aesthetic for you know, my project ultimately. And like it was just like a process of like seriously months of coming up like with like what I wanted, kept like struggling, and then like, you know, yeah, months down the road it happened.
Which piece was it, if we were to look it up?
Actually I don't have it online. Like I need to like go back and find it. Yeah, it's like on my computer, but I took it offline. But I can put it in my story later so you guys can see it.
Yeah, I would be very curious.
Yeah.
Cool. So Blake, when you're starting to work on a new project, what would you say you would consider to be the most important elements to focus on? And have you ever worked on something where you realize you veered too far from your style, and how did you handle that?
Yeah, definitely on the veering, but yeah. So when it comes to any project, I treat personal and commercial stuff very equally. You know, I want to have a consistent body of work, and so I try to give really fair playing time to anything I say yes to. And with that, the questions I always ask, whether myself or the client, etc., is what is the vision? What is the narrative? Are we expressing a story or a concept or a feeling? Like, what is that? You know, kind of that 1 to 2 sentence elevator pitch that they need to have, or I need to have, or it's muddy already. And then the other one is very much the opposite brain, where it's now what is the technical restraints of this, because I am in a technical trade. And so it's like, is this an interactive piece? Is this a still, a video, a 360? Is it long? Is it short, etc.? Because I think the combination of those two things, by kind of taking in that conceptual phase with your restrictions or even like the possibilities technical area, it gives you the freedom from the blank canvas sphere where you're like, I don't know how to get started. You know, like I'm overwhelmed, there's too much. Because you're like, no, I have a bounding box, and that bounding box is however this is going to be finalized, you know, whatever that deliverable is. But then the actual creative is able to be nourished within that up front without finding roadblocks and all of that down the road. So that's kind of my left and right way of handling the, you know, first kickoff of any project. When it comes to veering off style, absolutely, like almost every piece has had a very rough patch of development, because especially when you're translating it from a sketch, like the first thing is I work in a dimensional program, and dimension is not translated very well in sloppy sketches and chicken scratch notes and all those things. So when I have a piece and it's not going super smooth, regardless of what kind of project it is, my kind of tried and true way of figuring out how to get it corrected and back on the appropriate course that is something I'm proud of and confident in is to strip away. And I don't go bit by bit. Like I don't go, okay, like this should be render ready. It's super off. I don't know if it's color, lighting, etc. Let's try one or the other. I go all the way back to my original base scene. I remove lighting, I remove texturing, I remove everything. Like, is the form right? Is the scene right? If it's a person, is the pose aiming for the emotion I'm trying to convey or the sense of movement? And if that all checks off, then it's like, great. Now I'm going to keep everything off, but only figure out lighting. And then I'll add lighting. Is that the problem? Is that what's happening that's causing it to kind of veer off path somehow? And it's just going through that checklist until you do eventually figure out what it is. And you're able to kind of band-aid it and work it up. And it's a largely non-destructive process, which is really helpful for also being very time efficient, because we all have bills to pay, dreams that are on the checklist that are farther down the road, and we don't, you know, want to be too overly possessive with our work. So that's kind of the way that I juggle the whole situation. And I very much treat it as my just constant form of process for finalizing work.
Have you, this is just like a follow-up question, but have you ever like created something and just scratched it all and just be like,
yeah.
I can't look at this anymore?
I have like a really sad little archive folder with a bunch of X's in the name, where it's just like, this is the graveyard of things that maybe they were rendered and they failed in like the Photoshop or After Effects phase. Maybe I built it and I was like, this is amazing, it's going to be a masterpiece for myself and all this. And then it's just flaming hot garbage. And it doesn't even get the render button. But yeah, I think it's really important and also just healthy for your own mental space and creative space to know when something, you've tried it and it doesn't work, and you need to just have that ability to let it go. And who knows, maybe you can revisit it years later, kind of going back to the marinating upon ideas comment I gave earlier. But it's very important to not be overly possessive and think everything is perfect, because that's who I am. And it's like, no.
Cool. Arsolia, so you were just kind of talking about how everything's been, you know, a work in progress with your brand, but given, you know, Virtual Superland is very future forward, how do you envision the brand's identity evolving over the next 5 or 10 years?
I think if you mean identity in terms of like the crux of what the brand is and what we represent, will always be about joy and connection and bringing people together. So I don't think that will ever change, just because I think that's the key to what it's about. But I think in terms of what we maybe present or what we offer for an audience will definitely change, just because we constantly have to innovate. Like, you know, if you don't innovate, especially in this digital field, like I said in the very beginning, like tech and especially personal tech, like our phones, like everything is moving and changing at such a crazy rate. Like if we don't, you know, keep up with that, we're just gonna get left behind. And I think initially the idea of green screen and chroma key, it was kind of the conduit to be able to kind of express our idea, you know, like it was like, okay, how could we quickly and easily, because generally like the idea itself is not a brand new idea. Like green screen is not, I didn't create something crazy new. It was just a way for us to be like, okay, how could what we wear in the real physical world, how can it change and shift and be something else when we share it with our friends digitally? So, and also we made the app, like our app developer Adam, we literally made it in about six weeks. So it's never like this beta, like it is a beta. It's not like a final finished product of exactly what we want to kind of present. It's just kind of been a way that we can kind of show what we want to do and then carry on moving forward. So I think moving forward, we'll probably move away from just green screen and figure out how we can take those ideologies of connection and joy and you know, those good positive things, and also connecting graphics and making things interesting and wondrous in the digital world, and bring those together in a different way. So, you know, whether that's working on the app, and yeah, we have a lot of things that we want to kind of innovate towards and progress with. So yeah, that's our way forward.
Nice. So the next question is for Rory and Orsolia. So both of your works emphasize digital documentation. Do you think as people's perceptions of the world, you know, changes, the way that they document themselves would change as well? And we can start with Rory.
Yeah, like absolutely. I feel like our perception of the world is increasingly through the lens of technology. So like there's no other way to like really progress but to like, you know, start to document ourselves differently according to that. Like, and thinking about like wearables, like I feel like, you know, the future with wearables is like going to explode, and like what comes out of that, who knows, you know, people are gonna be recording themselves like probably a lot more, doing a lot more activities, and like it could become like a Black Mirror episode where you can recall like a moment in time, you know, on a specific day.
I'm ready to do that.
Like, who knows? I don't want to do that. I don't want to move towards that, but you know, I feel like that is coming, and people like have this desire to like preserve themselves, you know, and that's why we're like constantly like recording everything, even what we eat, you know. Well, some people, I don't, but you know.
Orsolia.
I was thinking about this, and I was wondering whether it is the perception of the world that will dictate how we document ourselves, because I wonder whether it's more, I feel like I don't give as much credit to human beings. I think we're pretty ego driven. And I think the center of our world will always be us, if you know what I mean? So I wonder if it's more about how we view ourselves in the context of how we're able to document ourselves. So, and I wonder if that's what will cause a shift, because it's almost like, for example, I was thinking about like, remember when Snapchat first made that dog filter? And then everyone was using this dog filter. And that was a way of obviously documenting ourselves. But it was like, well, that's not because we suddenly all love dogs. It was just because Snapchat had created this way of us looking cute and, you know, like, I don't know, affable. So everyone was like, oh, look at me, I'm cute and look like a dog, I'm going to share it. So I don't know, I wonder how it's more about how companies will kind of carry on having that power of how we document ourselves. And I wonder if that also kind of like will dictate, I don't know, like in how we do perceive the world. Like, I wonder how much of that is just us being able to like consider something without any real like influence of like the way that we can document. I don't know if I've just taken that question to a whole other place, but that's just how I was thinking about it.
No, that makes sense. Blake, with such surreal vision and aesthetic, are there any real world elements you turn to draw inspiration from? And I know you mentioned a little bit earlier, but I guess how do they impact your work, and how much of it is, you know, realistic versus, you know, in your imagination?
Yeah. So a lot of it is grounded in reality when it comes to creating an environment or a landscape or even a person. Like, so much of it does have very literal, real references to them. And with that, I know earlier I stated I have slowly become more aware of how much my geographic surroundings influence me. And in addition to that, I really have just like an expanded love for architecture and architectural photography. I think there's like a really beautiful artistry to it. And when I create, especially for the environments and stuff, I think something so integral is how do you create a piece that feels like it can be experienced in, that feels like it's not static, that there's something maybe just happened or is about to happen. You know, there feels like there can be a history to it or even a future. And with that, you really do have to turn to what exists in our reality, because the people that are soaking in your stuff are going to be humans like you. And you have to have that kind of tangible connection in some way. So outside of the architect love and general geography vibe, a big love for me, especially since moving to LA, has been just cinematography. I find it to be just a mind-boggling field, to be honest, when there's so many moving pieces, so many collaborators and people of different scopes, and there's just this main person or intimate team that creates these perfect scenes that all just come together at this wonderful moment, because it's extremely challenging to do. And with that, it's kind of led me recently to a rabbit hole of looking up iconic filmmakers, you know, all the greats, and seeing what their preferred focal lenses are. Because how much you change a lens completely can make or break not only a scene or, you know, a very clear object or focal point, but it can change the emotion it gives you, such as when you look at a vertigo shot and, you know, you get that panicky feeling. Or you can get this claustrophobic intenseness from like a really long lens versus a more wider one, such as one that like Spielberg used, is very much to soak in all the depth and dimension between everything. So I would say as a whole, it's architecture, geography, of course, as I've said a million times, but then also actual filmmaking and the process that goes into that / photography.
Yeah, I know that this last piece that we shared on our Lightbox into Instagram, I really wish I was there right now. We've all been stuck inside for a while, so it's definitely very dreamy.
Yeah. Doing environments definitely made me realize the value of translating it to the photography medium, because I was so used to doing very small compositions and using like an 80mm lens, and that does not work for spatial scenes. And so I was learning how to rework that wiring in my brain to figure out how to make things work for varying focal lengths.
Cool. So the next question is for Rory. Shapes and geometric structures seem to play an important role in your work. Can you tell us why that is?
Sure. You know, I really love the simplicity of like shapes and lines and how they can create something so much more complex. You know, as a kid, like my parents were both in science fields, like in college. So there was like textbooks lying around like biochem that look at these diagrams and look at like, you know, macro photography of like, you know, I don't know, like bacteria or whatever, and seeing the structures just like really captivated me. And there's like circuit boards laying around. Like I always like really love detailed structures. And, you know, I think about like how you can take something so small and it can become complex and relate that to like my own life, you know, in the sense of like all these small decisions, everything that we do like adds up to this fabric of our lives. And that's how I think about patterns too, like, you know, these seemingly insignificant little marks repeated over time, like consistently yield something. And so like that's like me pulling in, you know, the visual things I like about patterns, as well as like just how I think like they relate to our lives in general.
Were you good at science and geometry in school?
I always took a lot of science classes. I've never been a person who was great with math because I like the big picture, but when it comes to details, like I'm like a mad scientist. I like to get in and I like to just like go crazy and stir it up, you know, like I get too excited for the details. So yeah, but I do love science.
I love that. Scientists and artists.
Yeah.
So Blake and Orsolia, you both seem to delve into very out of this world spaces with your aesthetic. And we can start with Orsolia. How do you build these digital wonderlands, and in your case, you know, superlands, and tell a story through them?
Yeah, like the one behind us.
Exactly.
I think it's a combination of different things. Again, like Tasha and my co-founder and I generally will virtually, because she's mostly in London and I'm in LA, so we're actually kind of used to this virtual sharing of inspiration thing. We kind of will come together whenever we try and change our filters about every 3 months, and we kind of work on our other like Instagram, but not so like, I guess the Superlands are more kind of accurate towards the filters, because that's when we create these worlds that people can actually physically step into. So a lot of that just starts with us literally just finding whatever inspires us, like, like Blake said, like whether it's architecture, or I've also been inspired moving to LA just because of the colors, or that background one that's showing now. Those are like, I love opals and crystals, which is very, apt for living in LA, I guess. We just kind of bring together these different things that have inspired us, and then try and Tasha kind of figures out how we can kind of make those into like motion graphic representations of, how we feel. Like we're both obsessed of like, not intentionally, because I hate all those ASMR videos now, but like I love, like chrome, or like things moving, or things that look like that's like a hologram that we got inspired by. So a lot of it kind of is connected to like, I guess, connection and touch in a really weird kind of way, that kind of idea of like what makes you feel good if you look at it, whether it's, a planet in we also love science, by the way. Our greatest moment was when NASA have made all their like imagery available to everyone. So yeah, Blake is doing this. So like, I think it's just that, like drawing on from different kind of things and then figuring out how we can kind of create them. And also the other thing that I think we've started doing, we want to do more of, is we try and work with other female motion graphic designers and animators, and maybe also give them a space within the app. So for example, we recently worked with Diana Vandermeulen, she's an artist, but she also makes these kind of dreamy landscapes. And she had one of her like swampy landscapes in the app. So it was kind of like another way of getting a different sort of language of a different artist, but within a kind of our app, so we can share it with many different people. But it's kind of like a diversifies our offering as well. And we really want to keep doing that. And also just saying, well, I'm a huge fan of Blake and Rory. So just putting that out there. You're welcome.
Well, maybe something will come about after this. Blake, I know you answered that question a little bit earlier, talking about how you build your digital wonderlands, but is there anything else you want to add on that?
Yeah, so a lot of it for me is a really therapeutic process. Like when it's building out these dreamscapes, 90% of the time it is a labor of love versus for a client's reasoning. And with that, once you have your mixing pot of ideas, kind of like we've all talked about, you pull from your sources until it feels right, et cetera. For me, a lot of the concepting phase really just speeds up the actual development of it, because you're like, this is, maybe I was on a family vacation or something. And like, for example, the treehouse piece you spoke to earlier, that was just me kind of lounging with some family. We were soaking in some vitamin D, and I was just thinking of how it was so hot, and I would love an outdoor lounging area that could just cascade water down for the pure moisture of it, and like taking in those moments to be like, that's an interesting nugget. Now let me make it. And I made it like 6 months later, because again, it just wasn't right. And it was like, I just need to let things sit. When they're right, tackle them. And what's wonderful is you have this endless library of things that still aren't ready when you scroll back through the pages or through your notes app or whatever. And it's just this wonderful kind of gold mine. And there's been times too when building out a scene where I'll leave it for like 5 days. And I'm like, I can't touch this for a bit because something isn't clicking. I like it, it's not something to scrap, but what's wrong? And I've been able to just kind of doze off and have a daydream or actual dream where I'm like, oh, this directly fits the thing that I'm like troubleshooting right now. And it can be as simple as just like a kind of annihilation-y iridescent thing in, the background of a dream, to an actual interesting plant or building form, etc. I guess one other final note when it comes to like crafting out works, especially when it comes to the dreamscapes and stuff like that, is to actually have literal references. I know that sometimes illustrators or creatives in general feel very hit or miss about references. I don't know why. Literally all the masters from like human history have used references, so it doesn't really make sense to me. But a thing I love doing is I'll be like, okay, I want to create a piece that's half Art Deco, half Studio Ghibli. Where do those odds and ends of genres mix together and make something really exciting? You know, so those are kind of just fun little creative workshops I try to like mull over when it comes to figuring out how a piece can be unique and also be desirable to the person that is spectating it.
Cool. And I actually thought of a question for Rory when we were speaking about this. So both Blake and Rory participated in our Zaz Corner and Lightbox Live activation in Times Square. So you had your work shown there, which was really cool. And Rory, what could you say about the work that you created there? And I guess what type of story were you trying to tell with that?
Well, I wanted to do something that like involved like florals, but like in a way in which like it wasn't just like overtly floral. I wanted to like do something that like still referenced the universe, or even like, you know, maybe microscopic life, aquatic, like blending of like all those worlds together, and have it to be something that's kind of peaceful and just floating. I don't know. I wanted to have a like time be slowed down in a very busy area. I don't know if there's like much more to it, but yeah.
I mean, I saw it. It was definitely eye-catching for sure. I love that piece.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, I think we're going to turn it over to our audience. So I'm just going to check if anyone has any question, feel free to submit them on the chat or on our Instagram. And I should have told everyone to think about a question before the last question, but I didn't. So we'll just wait a little bit. So we have one question that came in. What are some projects that you're working on right now? And we'll start with Orsolia.
Well, most of our projects that we were going to have going on have been slightly sidelined thanks to the old pandemic outside. That's because a lot of the things that we do most recently have been events based. So it's kind of taken this whole idea of the green screen and having people in these like real life physical environments that digitally turn into something more interesting with the green screen. So we're kind of, those things have been sidelined, but we're sort of figuring out how we can kind of use like we have an app that you use at home, like, so we're utilizing that and just saying, okay, approaching brands in a way that like maybe we can make you a filter that lives within the app, and maybe you already sell green products, or maybe you can have a specific filter that works with this green product that people can then turn into something more fun at home. So I think we're just doing a lot of pitching and moving in that direction for the time being, but I don't think it's too bad thing. Like it doesn't feel unnatural for us, so we're just just pushing forward with that as opposed to real life things.
Cool. Blake, any projects you're working on?
Yeah, I'm finishing up my first short. It's about a minute and maybe 10 seconds. It will be starting to get marketed next Monday, and then released either next Wednesday or the week after. I'm still figuring out some logistics there, but that should be a fun one. I'm really excited. It has a heavy use of ZBrush and Cinema 4D, so it'll be a little different. And then other than that, I wrapped up a fun little collaboration in the fashion world that should go live in like a week or so as well, but I'm not allowed to talk about it or I will get yelled at by some creative directors. Just kidding, they're really wonderful. And then other than that, I just am trying to work on creating more interactive spaces. So right now I'm slowly creating this 360 playlist on YouTube that's all 8K renders, and I'm just trying to figure out how to add motion to those because 8Ks are really depressingly time consuming on a technical standpoint. So I'm troubleshooting that a bit. So in the next couple of weeks, if we're still all doomed to be internal and interior humans, maybe you can have some 360 playlist. Woo.
Rory, what are you working on, or anything coming up?
I'm always working on tying up loose ends and trying to like figure out what I want to do with my 360 pieces for the impermanence project. But like aside from that, I have a couple of projects that I don't really know like where they're going to be going yet, just with everything that's going on. And then like one thing that is a go, but not till 2021, for 150 media stream, which I'm really excited about because it's like this huge building link display that's broken up into panels, and I think it'll be a really interesting thing to create work for. So yeah.
Awesome. So this question is directed to Arsolia. What are some of your favorite apps that you use on a day-to-day basis?
So glad that I'm so glad that someone asked this, because I have a huge app obsession. So I mean, shall I just list them all? There's a lot.
Up to you. Top
okay.
3, top 5.
Oh, God, top 10. So Glitch is incredible. I don't know if anyone knows Glitch. It's amazing. Then also, I mean, okay, for AR apps, there's an amazing app called Slapstick, which is just puts like, it's by this art studio called Buck, and it just puts really fun, cute little things into your environment. Giphy World have also done a really cool AR app, Paintspace AR, Rave with the 4, that's really cool. I mean, also the Gucci app is surprisingly cool. Like, you could find really cool things like wallpapers to download for your phone, or like little fun arcade games, or try on glasses and then share the whole experience. So there's just, there's a lot of things. I don't know, that's my main, probably my main apps that I use on a regular basis, but definitely Glitch. It's really cool.
Awesome, I'll check them out. The next question is, I noticed 2 panelists mention Lisa Frank. How do you situate her on the art/business scale?
Oh, is that like how she's like a terrible human in real life? Because I like was mind blown by that revelation.
I did not know that, but
yeah, she runs like a crazy sweatshop or something. But yeah, no, she's no bueno as a human, if that's the
No.
But no, I think it's but as for her work, I think I'm just blindly assuming a lot of us probably had kind of similar childhoods in the age range, etc. But she was just like canon for that. Like, I remember back to school phase just being like, awesome, what Lisa Frank stuff isn't sold out yet? Like, what folder can I get, or cool backpack, or pencil holder? So I think it's just because it was growing up when it was the pinnacle of that kind of weird, colorful artwork, and being so kid friendly and being of that kid age, that it just has had such a lasting impression on a lot of digital artists.
Mm. Rory, can you relate to that too? I think you mentioned her as well.
I did. Like, yeah, I love Lisa Frank when I was a kid. Like, the folders and everything, it's just like so magical and like candy delicious, you know. And so like, yeah, it's just something that like nostalgically, like, I'm really drawn to. I don't know. I mean, like, for someone like her to have that sort of aesthetic, like, you know, I feel like she's like incredibly, I don't know if it's like something to strive towards or something, but to have like this work that's like so massively consumed and by like children, I don't know, it's like a very interesting sort of, I don't think that very many people put their name on, like, you may see something and recognize it, but their name is not attached to it. And that's something that's interesting about like her work to me. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Cool. 3 more questions. What are some new and emerging technologies you're excited about working with, or that have been a game changer for you? And that's actually a question that has come up in previous panel discussions. I don't know, Blake, if you want to start.
Yeah, real-time rendering, obviously. I've been really neglectful on learning it myself, and I need to. I feel like I'm already probably a little behind in getting on that wave, so this is me holding myself accountable. I'll do it soon, I swear. But that, I think, is just a huge game changer, especially seeing how it works across gaming to film to just interactive spaces and everything. It's just one of those technologies you can't really keep ignoring. With that, obviously, learning a game engine goes hand in hand with that. Other than that, I think it's really just keeping at least with what I do, it's so dependent. I'm not a developer, so I have to wait until things are accessible enough for me to introduce it into my pipeline, which of course the thing I just mentioned is now. But I try to always keep an eye out for AR. When is the next big thing for it? You know, I work with really demanding scenes, and while I can translate over some of the technical aspects like lighting and texturing, there's still a lot of limitations in the realm. And so it's just making sure that you're keeping an eye out for when that intersection is ready for you. So AR, interactive stuff in general, real-time rendering, those are like the things that I'm still very much keeping all my eyeballs peeled on.
Someone also, and I'll get to Orsolia and Rory on that question, but someone did ask, Blake, what your favorite video codec is?
Video codec? That's such an, I mean, I guess I have to always give an H.264. So just for the sake of laziness, I guess I like H.264. Okay. I don't know. I've never been asked that question.
I don't even know what it means, but I'll take the answer. So
whoever asked it, if you don't like that answer, just holler after.
Rory, any exciting technology that you're excited about working with, or anything that has been a game changer?
Yeah, like same, like AR, VR, thinking about holograms, like anything where you can like mix the real world and with this fantasy world, you know, I'm very much interested in that. I think it's like a wonderful tool for engaging in storytelling, and it just takes it to the next level where, as before, you know, people were, you know, static consumers, but now it's like you can really invite someone into your world and like tell a story in a completely different way.
Rosalia?
I was just finding the name of it because Microsoft we're doing a lot of research into where technology is going in terms of AR, and especially with clothing, and that's really interesting in how that's developing, because there's a lot of things that are being developed that can, you know, scan clothing and change your clothing. So obviously that interests us. But I remember I read recently Microsoft have developed this technology. I don't know if it's HoloLens, because I think HoloLens already exists, so I've forgotten the name of it. But basically you each put on a headset, and then you can see that person in your environment on the headset. So say if someone's like far away from you, like somewhere else, obviously not in the room with you, and then the whole experience of you two having that conversation could be recorded. So it basically scans like your whole body and scans the other person's body. So the whole room is kind of set up, and it's not just the glasses. This sounds crazy. This does exist. The real name for it. But because you're scanned in your environment and they're scanned in your environment and you're put into each other's environment, you could then record that interaction, and then you could, this is kind of crazy, but then you could play that back at another time. So it's almost like, I think Rory said this before, of like recording, it's kind of like recording a memory, because you can record that conversation. You can watch yourselves in that situation having that conversation just like you had it, which kind of blows my mind a little bit, but I think, yeah, it's really, really interesting. So I guess that's the way forward of, yeah, continuing pushing forward in AR and VR. So that interests me.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So we'll take this last question. How do you prioritize client work versus personal work? We'll start with Blake again, and then we'll go.
Sure. Yeah, client work, sometimes, you know, when things are amazing, you have to know when to say no or you'll go crazy. But on the day-to-day, when things are super healthy and a balanced level of client work, a lot of times it's, for me, project management, which is not my passion. But I write weekly lists with checklists because I get the satisfaction of checking things off. Like for me, that somehow does trick my brain into being more efficient. And I'll do little timestamps next to like, okay, I'm gonna make tea and have breakfast. I work Pacific and East Coast hours, so I kind of am at my computer odd amounts throughout the day, though it's for a long span. But so it's like 7 a.m. to, you know, 7:45, I'm gonna make breakfast. By 11 a.m., I'm done with my first milestone for client project number 1 today. By 2 p.m., I, you know, have had lunch slotted in somewhere, but now my second client project is good for the day. And I kind of go through these systems, and I try to not work more than 2 client projects a day, because, work a little every day, make sure you're not killing yourself with a deadline, etc. Because also, of course, if you're not feeling creative the day of a deadline, you're really screwed if you're a procrastinator. But so with those timestamps and kind of doing that checklist form that does hold me accountable and somehow works on me, that almost always opens up about 2 hours an evening for me to be able to be super selfish, still have time to cook dinner, chill with my partner, my neighbors, be able to just, decompress, because that is extremely important to feed your soul as well as being productive, and kind of just not go crazy at the same time. Because there are phases, for me personally, I don't know if everyone shares the same busy schedule, but the end of the year is always really teetering on overtime, unhealthy amounts of client work. That's kind of been the standard for the 5 years that I've been freelancing. And during those times, a lot of times, even with all the little hacks I've tried to introduce to my workflow, you just have to kind of live at your desk a bit, and you really have to put in the work and get it out, because bills need to get paid, projects need to get out, and it's just busy. And so with that, I do see a sacrifice on my personal happiness. And like, I don't get to be selfish with the craft I love doing and the field I'm really in love with, but I'm like, just enslaved to this client overload, and I just have to deal with it. So it's like there's always balance. That's never perfect. I go through times of too much free time and times of 0 free time for weeks, but trying to keep that balance has kept me at a largely healthy schedule for at least, 10 months a year, which I feel blessed to say.
Awesome.
That's great. Rosalia?
I think this balance that Blake is talking about is the dream of dreams. I would love to just learn from that.
It took training, I promise.
I don't know, it's really hard when you're kind of running, because we have so many different aspects of our company. Like we also have the clothing element, we're working on the app, we also make a lot of graphics and stuff. There's so many different parts to it, so I feel like I'm constantly, and Tasha, we're constantly working on it. Like there's very little, like even if I'm like, I don't know, doing the Instagram or the social media, in a weird way, that's almost, I feel like that's my downtime, but I don't think that's downtime. That's still work. So I don't know, I definitely feel like I need to give a little bit more space to be creative and have a little bit more space to, I don't know, I guess let that creativity kind of breathe, instead of just mostly focusing on like moving forward with work. But I'm it's like you said, it's a balance. We're trying. So yeah.
What about you, Rory?
For me, like, I think that my life is a constant state of organized chaos. Like, as far as like my own personal work is concerned, like I'm always creating like on the go, like everything that like, like say for instance, I do a lot of time lapse videos or whatever, and that all relates back to like my ongoing projects. So I'm always trying to figure out ways of being able to create on the go and like have that flow steady. And I write a lot of lists, and I utilize every moment of time that comes to me. If it's 15 minutes, I'm like, what can I do with the 15 minutes? And sometimes like that 15 minutes can make like a huge difference in a project if I have something that clicks. And like sometimes it's just 15 minutes I spent doing something, but like I kind of like try to always stay in motion. That's just kind of how I operate as a person. So like, yeah, for me, a constant state of motion and the constant like plate or schedule of doing things kind of feels most comfortable for me.
Awesome. Well, I think this wraps it up. Thanks to Rory, Blake, and Rosalia for joining. This was perfect timing. Thanks to our audience for watching. I invite you to stick around and check out our virtual Lightbox with all of their work in our space, which is usually how it would have looked if we had done this in person. But actually, this worked out perfectly because Blake and Ursula, you guys are in LA and Rory in Chicago. So I was so excited to have this conversation with you. Thank you all, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for our next Lightbox Live panel. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.